What experience do you have with Azure Administration?
I have 3 years of experience working with Azure Administration. During this time, I have gained experience in areas such as deploying and managing virtual machines, setting up and managing storage solutions, configuring and managing virtual networks, and implementing and managing Azure Active Directory. I have also worked with Azure Resource Manager, ARM, templates and have experience with Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI.
Can you explain how Azure Resource Manager, ARM, templates work?
Azure Resource Manager, ARM, templates are a way to define, deploy, and manage resources in Azure. They allow you to define the resources you want to deploy in a JSON file, and then use that template to deploy those resources to Azure. The template defines the resources, their properties, and their dependencies, and Azure Resource Manager takes care of creating and configuring the resources according to the template. This allows for easy deployment and management of resources, as well as the ability to version and roll back changes.
How do you handle backups and disaster recovery in Azure?
In Azure, there are several options for handling backups and disaster recovery, such as Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery. Azure Backup allows you to create backups of Azure virtual machines, SQL databases, and files in Azure File Storage. It also allows you to store backups in a recovery services vault for long-term retention. Azure Site Recovery allows you to replicate and protect on-premises and Azure virtual machines, so that in the event of a disaster, you can fail over to the replicated virtual machines. I have experience setting up and configuring both Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery to protect and recover resources in case of any disaster.
How do you monitor and troubleshoot Azure resources?
Azure provides several tools for monitoring and troubleshooting resources, such as Azure Monitor, Azure Log Analytics, and Azure Diagnostic Recovery. Azure Monitor allows you to collect, analyze, and act on telemetry data from Azure resources. It allows you to set up alerts, view performance metrics, and create custom dashboards. Azure Log Analytics allows you to collect, search, and analyze log data from Azure resources. It allows you to set up custom queries, alerts, and dashboards. Azure Diagnostics and Recovery allows you to diagnose and troubleshoot issues with Azure resources. It allows you to collect diagnostic data and view detailed performance metrics. I have experience using these tools to monitor and troubleshoot resources in Azure, and I know how to set up alerts and custom queries to quickly identify and resolve issues.
How do you manage network security in Azure?
Azure provides several tools for managing network security, such as Azure Firewall, Azure Virtual Network, and Azure Security Center. Azure Firewall allows you to create a firewall that can be applied to the entire virtual network or specific subnets. It allows you to configure network security rules to control inbound and outbound traffic. Azure Virtual Network allows you to create virtual networks that can be used to segment and isolate resources. It also allows you to create and configure network security groups, NSGs, to control inbound and outbound traffic. Azure Security Center allows you to monitor and manage security across your Azure resources. It allows you to view security recommendations, configure security policies, and set up security alerts. I have experience configuring and managing Azure Firewall, Azure Virtual Network, and Azure Security Center to secure network traffic and protect resources.
How do you implement and manage Azure Active Directory?
To implement and manage Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, you can use the Azure portal, Azure PowerShell, or Azure CLI. You can create and manage users and groups, and set up and configure multi-factor authentication. You can also integrate Azure AD with other services such as Office 365, to provide a single sign-on experience for users. You can also use Azure AD to configure conditional access policies to secure access to resources. Additionally, you can use Azure AD to provide access to external users and to authenticate against other identity providers.
How do you scale and manage Azure virtual machines?
To scale and manage Azure virtual machines, you can use the Azure portal, Azure PowerShell, or Azure CLI. You can create and configure virtual machines, and manage their resources such as CPU, memory, and storage. You can also use Azure Automation to automate common management tasks and Azure Monitor to monitor the performance and health of virtual machines. Additionally, you can use Azure Scale Sets to automatically scale the number of virtual machines based on demand.
Can you explain the difference between Azure Public and Private Cloud?
Azure Public Cloud refers to the Azure services that are available to the public, such as Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Storage, and Azure SQL Database. These services are hosted on shared infrastructure and are accessible over the Internet. Azure Private Cloud refers to the Azure services that are hosted on dedicated infrastructure, such as Azure Stack. Azure Stack is an extension of Azure that allows organizations to run Azure services on-premises or in a data center, behind a firewall. This allows organizations to have more control over their data and to comply with certain regulations.
How do you manage and optimize Azure storage?
To manage and optimize Azure storage, you can use the Azure portal, Azure PowerShell, or Azure CLI. You can create and configure storage accounts, and manage the data stored in them. You can also use Azure Storage Explorer to manage and access data stored in storage accounts. Additionally, you can use Azure Monitor to monitor the performance and health of storage accounts and Azure Backup to protect data stored in storage accounts.
Can you explain how Azure ExpressRoute works?
Azure ExpressRoute is a service that allows you to create a private connection between an Azure data center and your on-premises infrastructure. This connection is established through a dedicated circuit provided by a network service provider. ExpressRoute connections do not go over the public internet, providing a more secure and reliable connection. With ExpressRoute, you can access Azure services such as Azure Virtual Machines and Azure Storage, as well as Azure services that are not available over the Internet, such as Azure Virtual Network and Azure SQL Database. ExpressRoute also allows for more control over network traffic and can be used to improve performance for workloads that require low latency.